and welcome to another One History Help video with me, Mrs. O'Neill. We're here today to talk about medicine during the Renaissance era. So hopefully you've already watched your video, the video that's on the medicine during the medieval period, because this is a beautiful follow-on from there. Just to say, this is the second of 4 videos that will be put up on One History Help about the medicine course. Medicine courses are done on lots of thematic studies with GCSE, and I've divided it down into 4 time periods: medieval, Renaissance, industrial and modern. And obviously, as you can see, today we are looking at the Renaissance, or the Renaissance for anyone who is watching from over in America. So hopefully you've got everything in front of you that you would like to have during your time watching these videos, and we will get started very shortly with an introduction to the Renaissance, and then we'll be going through a lot of kind of key individuals here for the Renaissance study, and where possible I will make links to other videos that are available to you as well. Let's get started. So here's a quick overview then of what it is that we are going to be taking a look at. We're going to start with a brief introduction to what the Renaissance was, a little bit of an understanding of why it happened. We're going to look at some key individuals: Vesalius, Paré, Harvey, John Hunter as well. We're going to have a look at the Great Plague and the difference with that and the Black Death, and then we're going to look at hospitals and doctors as well. Starting off then with what the Renaissance was, why it happened, and generally speaking, if you type in the word Renaissance into Google, this is the first image that will come up. Art is a significantly huge part of the Renaissance, and if you think about some of the images we had in the medieval video and how different it is in this video, in this picture here, we can see just how much advancement was made. For those of you who have studied art or are interested in art, one of my big passions is art history. I absolutely adore art history, and I've been spending some time this year learning a little bit more about that. And one of the things that is so why this picture is referenced so often is that it's a really, really good example about the use of perspective in art. This idea of having a vanishing point that things disappear to, i.e. things in the foreground are larger than things in the background there. This idea of perspective and lots of leading lines going in as well. Oh, I absolutely love it. Anyway, we're not here to talk about the history of art, sadly. We're here to talk about medical history. Let's move on to our introduction about the Renaissance. So the word Renaissance is a French term meaning rebirth, and the Renaissance at this time is mainly based in Italy. That's where we kind of see the cradle of the Renaissance, especially in the significant cities of Florence and also to an extent Venice as well. It's mainly based in Italy, but the ideology and the ideas of the Renaissance spread throughout Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, that being the 1500s and the 1600s. So for us, in terms of British history, the Renaissance overlaps with the Tudors and the Stuarts. That's what it overlaps with. So Henry VIII, English Civil War, Gunpowder Plot, all of that stuff is happening during the Renaissance. They overlap, they happen at the same time. So the reason why these ideas spread so much throughout Europe is because there was much more widespread trade and travel going on at this time. The Renaissance is a rebirth of ancient ideas. The ideas of the Greeks and Romans became very, very fashionable at this time. And the term that we use for this kind of fascination with the ancient Greeks and Romans and their way of thinking, we call it humanism. Humanism during the Renaissance, this idea of wanting to emulate and replicate the thinking of the Greeks and the Romans, particularly the Greeks. Remember, the Greeks were big philosophers. They were the ones who wanted to understand things better. In the Renaissance, they wanted to take those thoughts and extend on them and to really use the technology that they had available to them at this time to take those ideas even further. So for instance, it's going to be around this time where we start to get the work of a Polish scientist called Copernicus, who does work to do with the planets, for instance, and being able to view things that way. We get Galileo and the invention of the telescope during the Renaissance, to mention but a few. So humanism is very much about this idea of being an emulatory example of the Greeks and the Romans. Lots of developments in art, like I was mentioning to you beforehand. This is when we get the famous Renaissance artists of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo as well. And we see that in terms of painting art, but in all forms of art as well. Sculpture has a massive renaissance at this time as well, a massive boost, a massive rebirth, and architecture really develops at this time. It's around this time where we start to get in Europe a lot more domed buildings. You'll remember from the video that I did with you guys on the medieval medicine course, part of the course, these ideas about how to build a dome were brought over from the Islamic Empire during the Crusades, and they are developed on during this time, which is why a lot of the key buildings of the Renaissance, such as the Duomo in Florence, the main cathedral in Florence, which is very famously got this beautiful red brick dome. We've also got St. Peter's Basilica in Rome as well, in the Vatican City in Rome. But even a bit closer to home, in London, we have, following the Great Fire of London, the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral, which is going to be the first domed building in our country. So massive developments in art with the likes of Da Vinci and Michelangelo. Brunelleschi is another really key individual in the arts as well. And what was really important, and this is me going to spiel on a little bit here about art history, but I find this just so fascinating. During the medieval times, artists were seen as craftsmen. So they were kind of lumped together with carpenters, blacksmiths, surgeons, for instance, people who basically worked with their hands. They were craftsmen. They were skilled and produced things with their hands. They weren't kind of associated, if we think about like the likes of Da Vinci and Michelangelo, for instance. You know, in the medieval times, artists weren't associated with high culture or anything like that. You know, it was, you know, making a sculpture was the same as making a chair in the medieval times. During the Renaissance, this begins to change, and artistry and art as a part of society is really elevated up beyond the idea of it being a craft to something that you need a refined palate and taste to appreciate. This is why we start to see, for instance, lots of members of royal families and people of power and nobility across Europe having paintings dedicated to them and made to them. And what they start to do in the Renaissance time is they start to send out all across Europe for famous artists to come and paint pictures of them. An example that we can use from our country is if you think about that really famous portrait of Henry VIII that was painted by Hans Holbein. Hans Holbein wasn't British, he wasn't English, he was brought over, I forget now if it was from the Netherlands or Germany, but it was in that kind of area. So the art is becoming very refined and something that is very much associated with the aristocracy and the nobility as well. Previously, back in the medieval times, most people accessed art through the church. That's the main way that we were able to access it. But now rulers are using art to demonstrate their power and their prestige as well. We talked previously about how a lot of ideas spread from Italy to other countries because of widespread trade and travel at this time. But also a significant invention is created in the late 1400s, the printing press, which was created by a German inventor, Gutenberg, which helps the spread of knowledge. So prior to the printing press, all books were written out by hand, whereas now books can be made a lot quicker and a lot easier as well. Essentially, you would have these tiles which had all the necessary letters that you wanted, and you'd put them in place, you'd smear the ink over the top and press the paper on the top of that, i.e. a printing press. It literally does what it says on the tin. You may well have experimented with this in art lessons and things like that as well. So this is a significant development in the factor of communications because it means books can be made very easily and can also be made very quickly as well. During the Renaissance, we have a lot less control from the church. We start to see new elements of power that are coming about during this time. It's during the Renaissance that we're going to get the Protestant church happening, the Reformation in our country and in other countries as well. For instance, when Henry VIII sets up the Church of England, this is going to see a weakening in power of the church that had been held over European Christendom for centuries. Now that many countries like Germany, like England, are starting to establish their own churches where their monarch is in charge instead, it's starting to see the power of the Catholic Church, I should say, starting to weaken. Don't get me wrong, the Catholic Church is never going to be incredibly weak, but compared to what it used to be, it has definitely got some competition out there in terms of other options for religion. One of the significant impacts this has on medicine is that rules are now lightened about dissection of bodies. And whereas previously dissection of bodies had been forbidden for centuries, finally it is now allowed. And that change in the rules of dissection are going to have a huge impact on this individual right here, Andreas Vesalius. So Vesalius, incidentally, it's absolutely fine to refer to individuals in your exam by their last name. The only time you would need to differ with that is if you had an individual with the same last name. And I'm thinking about the medicine course, and although we get a lot of people with the same first name, we don't get many people with the same second name. We don't get any, in fact, so we don't have to worry too much about that. But it goes for any of the papers that you're doing. Anyway, Vesalius, Andreas Vesalius. Vesalius was a specialist in the anatomy. Now, the anatomy is about what the body looks like, how it is put together. It is not about how the body works. So the anatomy is, here is a liver and here's where it goes. Here is your brain, here is where it goes, and so on and so forth. Vesalius himself was Belgian, but he studied in Padua in Italy. So he studies in the university in Padua in Italy, and he also goes on to lecture there as well. And the big thing that he really pushes is the importance of dissection. You can't learn about the anatomy without taking the body apart. And he would often do these demonstrations in the University of Padua to prove the theories that he came up with. Importantly, another break from the church's power here means that people are now able to prove Galen wrong. They're able to go against Galen's teachings. And through performing dissection, Vesalius is able to do this. Through dissection, he is able to disprove Galen. Galen believed that the human jawbone was made of two bones. However, Vesalius is able to prove that that is not the case, and it is only made from one bone. Feel free to kind of feel it for yourself now. I'm actually doing it while I'm talking to you. You can feel that one bone right down there. And you've got what's called your, I wish I knew what the initials stood for, but your TMJ, I think it's your teeth, mouth and jaw, maybe, I'm not too sure. But that little bit right under your earlobes, like I'm kind of pressing into mine right now. Oh, ow, mine just clicked. Oh, no, that's not good. You can probably feel it moving, like if you're talking, or if you just want to open and close your mouth. I'm going to stop and do that now. You can feel how your jaw is connected to the rest of your skull. So Galen thought that there were two bones within that. And Vesalius says, no, there's not. There's only one. Let me show you. And that's something that Galen could never do. He'll say, let me show you on a pig. Let me show you on an ape, but not on a human body. Vesalius is also able to prove that the breastbone, your rib cage, has 3 parts and not 7. And importantly, and we're going to see this impact on another individual in the Renaissance, William Harvey, Vesalius is able to prove that blood did not flow through the heart through invisible holes, which again is what Galen said. Vesalius writes up his findings in this absolutely stunning book, The Fabrica, the fabric of the human body, which is full of these illustrations of dissection. If you Google fabric of the human body and just take a second to look at some of those images, they are absolutely stunning. And it kind of matches up with the developments in art that were happening at this time. I mean, no disrespect intended here to our medieval brothers and sisters, but they really couldn't have produced drawings of the quality that we are seeing in the Renaissance at all. They are very similar to illustrations that Leonardo da Vinci also does as well. He also does dissections of the human body and produces pictures, and he does a really stunning sequence of images which looked at a baby inside the womb. Really, really stunning. I went on holiday to Florence a couple of years ago. Beautiful city. I strongly recommend a visit, by the way. Absolutely stunning. Although I've got to say, pretty pricey, you know, when it comes to like buying food and drink. So yeah, but I would definitely recommend going to see it. Anyway, there's a museum dedicated to Leonardo da Vinci there, and you were able to see some of these illustrations, and they are just absolutely stunning, the detail that they go into. And the Fabrica, the fabric of the human body, is much the same as well. So for instance, in the Fabrica, the fabric of the human body, Vesalius gets these images drawn of human bodies standing in lots of different poses to demonstrate what the muscles look like. So for instance, if you stand with both of your hands above your head, your arms up high, for instance, or out to the side, your muscles will tense in different ways. And he used these illustrations to demonstrate that. If you've ever been to the Science Museum in London, or if you've not been before, again, another great museum to go to. Unlike the Leonardo da Vinci Museum in Florence, the Science Museum is free. And on the very top floor of the Science Museum in London, it is completely dedicated to medical history. And on the top floor, you can actually see an original copy of the Fabrica, and it is open on one of those pages where you can see it. And you'll see just how big this book is. It is really thick. It's like an encyclopedia of the human body almost. And remember, we've got that printing press, which means, yes, okay, Vesalius is doing his findings in Padua in Italy, but we here in Britain, in England, are able to get a copy of this book thanks to the printing press and thanks to widespread trade and travel. So Andreas Vesalius, specialising in the anatomy of the human body, is going to have a big impact on the other two individuals, actually the other individuals that we're going to be learning about during the Renaissance and also beyond it as well. The next individual we're going to look at is Ambroise Paré, pointy beard Paré, I like to refer to him as, and he is going to be a specialist for us here in surgery. So Paré was a French battlefield surgeon. So here's a nice example of the factor of war in medicine, war and individuals as well. Paré comes up with 3 key discoveries or inventions, if you will, during his time as a battlefield surgeon for the French army. The first one is he developed something called ligatures. Now ligatures are a silk thread that would be used to tie off blood vessels. So let's say, for instance, that you had a surface wound stab from, I'm just trying to think in a battle sense here. Imagine you had a cut on your arm, and what would normally happen is to stop the blood coming out, they would get like a red hot iron. I always imagine something like a soldering iron, if you've ever used one of those in technology, and basically they would put it and press it against that open wound. And what they were effectively doing was burning your blood vessels to stop them from bleeding. As you can imagine, that is incredibly painful, and it would have been really difficult to anaesthetize somebody in time to stop the blood flow from happening as well. So Paré comes up with this idea of using the ligatures to tie off the ends of the blood vessels to stop the bleeding in that way. If you've ever seen, for instance, somebody who is, well, like on telly or something like that, bleeding excessively, what they tend to do is apply pressure, and the pressure stops the blood from flowing through. Now, that's essentially what a ligature is doing. This sounds great. Jump back a second. It's a little bit like a stitch. If you've ever had stitches before or know someone who has stitches, it's not dissimilar to that. Again, this sounds great. These silk threads are nowhere near as painful as being burnt to stop the bleeding. But the issue is we are still dealing with a time here that they are unaware of germs. So these threads were often dirty and would therefore carry infection into the body. So good on you, Paré, for finding something that is a lot less painful than cauterizing. Not so great that you've introduced something that's going to carry infection into the body, even though you were unaware of it. Something else that he does, and this is a nice link here to the work of Vesalius as well, is Paré makes a range of false limbs for wounded soldiers. As we would have discussed in the video about medieval medicine, amputation was incredibly common and had been since, since war began, really, you could argue. And what Paré starts to do is, using the knowledge of the anatomy that Vesalius has developed in the Fabrica, he is able to consider, for instance, what a false hand would look like. Well, he knows what a hand would look like, don't get me wrong, but in terms of what it would need to have in terms of mechanism to be able to operate like a hand. And again, you can Google Paré false limbs and you will see some of the illustrations that they came up with. Obviously, nothing as near as sophisticated as we have nowadays, But these are the beginnings. If we're thinking about long-term impact here, this is something that can be developed on as technology improves over time. So we've got lots of factors so far, haven't we? So we've got war and individuals. We have got this idea of technology as well, science and technology. And next we get a really strong example of chance in medicine. Personally, I kind of wish the factor of chance wasn't in our study, because I feel uncomfortable saying the idea that all the best things happened by accident, because I just don't think that's true, as we'll kind of see here in a way. So before he comes up with this idea of ligatures, Paré is still cauterizing people and using oil to be able to do that. And by chance, he runs out of oil. Okay, he runs out of oil. And because of this, and because we're in a war situation, we're in a battle situation here, he needs to think of a solution, an alternative quickly. One of the things I often say is, imagine Paré wasn't a battlefield surgeon. Imagine this happened to him and he was just a normal surgeon and it happened to him during surgery. What would happen? If he ran out of oil, what would happen? He'd go and get some more, or probably send someone else to go and get some more. But you can't do that in a battlefield. If someone needs to have their wound cauterizing, it needs to happen there and then. So what he does is he comes up with a herbal remedy to treat wounds. I've kind of given some artistic license to Paré here. I said he finds his own remedy. Technically speaking, it was a Roman remedy. It was an old Roman remedy that existed. And he is able to recall it and put it together. So I love the fact he doesn't have any more cauterizing oil available, but he does have access to eggs, rose oil and turpentine as well. But anyway, basically what he does is he comes up with this herbal remedy for treating gunshot wounds instead. And it is very successful and nowhere near as hideous as having to have something cauterized. So just by chance, running out of oil means he's able to find a much better solution. And much like pretty much every individual from our study, Paré writes his findings down, and he writes over 10 books on his works on surgery. That sounds significant, but we're going to come across an individual in this presentation, in this video, who writes significantly more than that. But nonetheless, I'm hoping what we're starting to see here is how different factors can be seen in individuals, and also how our different individuals are linking together. Oh, hello. Jessie's come to join us. Next, we're going to be having a look at a British physician, if I can speak, called William Harvey. So William Harvey specialised in physiology. And physiology is to do with how the human body works. Anatomy is what the body looks like. Physiology is how it works. Vesalius could say, to use the same organs again, here is your liver. Harvey would be able to tell you this is how your liver works. Harvey was a very skilled doctor, so much so that he was the physician to Charles I, the English king who was executed at the end of the English Civil War in the 1640s. Harvey's main fascination with physiology was to do with the link between the heart and our blood in our body. And he is not the first individual to look into this. We've got evidence of some individuals from the Islamic Empire during the medieval times kind of making similar inquiries as well. However, the difference here is Harvey is able to dissect a human body, whereas those people in the Islamic Empire in the medieval times were unable to. Before he moves on to an actual human body though, one of the things that William Harvey does, he dissects live cold-blooded animals, so like a lizard or a newt or something like that. And he does that because he wants to be able to look at the movement of the blood around the body and how the heart moves as well. And he would use a cold-blooded animal for this because their circulatory systems operate a lot slower than a warm-blooded animal does. So he's able to really properly observe how it works. He then dissected human bodies to back up what he found in those cold-blooded animals. And what he was able to do is he was able to prove that the heart pumped blood around the body in a one-way system. And his thoughts around this idea of the heart being a pump were very much inspired by developments in technology in England at this time, looking at water pumps, the way that it would pump water up from below the ground, for instance. So he was very much inspired by that technological advance and tried to apply that to the heart, and was able to prove that that's what happens. The heart pumps the blood around the body, and that is what you can feel your heart doing. When you can feel your heart beating, that is what it's doing. It's pumping the blood around your body. And he's able to prove that it moves in a one-way system. And if you Google Harvey veins diagram, you'll be able to see it in more detail. I won't be able to describe it particularly well to you because you can't see my arm, but essentially what he does is he puts his finger onto a vein and an artery, and he is able to push some pressure down, nothing painful, and what he notices is that your blood stops flowing, and then when you release it, it goes back again. And he is able to demonstrate that where you put your finger on it, if the blood stops before your finger or after it, demonstrates the direction your blood is going in. This is where my understanding of biology and science kind of drifts away ever so slightly. So feel free to ask a science teacher or look at some of your stuff to do with biology to help you here, because I believe your veins carry things one way and your arteries carry things another. So that is what essentially Harvey is doing. He is putting all of this circulatory system together. Unfortunately, he's not able to see anything like capillaries. There isn't any kind of powerful enough microscopes at this time to be able to identify that. But in his discovery, what Harvey is able to do is he is able to disprove Galen. One of Galen's teachings was that our body constantly remade blood. Constantly. And actually he believed that happened in the liver, that your body would create blood in the liver and it would send new blood around your body. And because of Galen's ideas, it was okay to bleed somebody. Bloodletting was okay. It doesn't matter how much blood you let from somebody, because your body will just create more. That is what Galen believed. But Harvey is able to prove that is not true, that you don't have an infinite supply of blood. You have a finite supply of blood in your body. And therefore, he is able to say bloodletting isn't a treatment that we should be using. However, it's going to take a long time for that to catch on. If you think about it, Harvey is coming along and saying, hey guys, we really shouldn't be doing bloodletting at all. And people are going to go, well, we've been doing this for literally thousands of years. So I'm not going to be stopping anytime soon. Just because you say so, William Harvey, just because one person says so, doesn't mean that I'm going to do it. But it does catch on eventually. It does take a while. Don't get me wrong. We're still bloodletting as a treatment into the industrial era. It does catch on eventually, especially as more and more work is done surrounding blood groups and blood transfusions as well. And that's something that we'll see happening in the First World War. So this is really significant. I think it's arguably one of the most significant discoveries in our medicine course, because essentially Harvey has found what underpins human existence, the importance of the heart pumping blood around the body. Thanks to his theory, like I said, bloodletting doesn't make sense. And one thing that will later go on to make sense will be things like vaccination. If we think about how a vaccine works, if Galen was right, and that you constantly remade blood in your body, you would need to get vaccinated all the time, because you'd get your jab, you get your vaccine, and then your body would burn up the blood and create new blood, and then you need to be vaccinated again, and so on and so forth. Harvey's theory, however, says that's not going to be necessary. Eventually, remember, we haven't got vaccines at this time, but eventually when Jenner does his work, he is able to apply Harvey's thinking and says, well, you only ever need one vaccine because you only ever have one supply of blood. So significant developments there. Paré is also able to use Harvey's findings as well, for instance, with the idea of blood flow and ligatures. He's going to need to know that in terms of how to tie up blood vessels appropriately, especially because of this concept of a one-way system of blood. Oh yeah, just over there. Takes a long time for his ideas to catch on, and bloodletting is still used as a main treatment. And that kind of just demonstrates, isn't it, how, one person isn't always convincing enough. Despite the fact Harvey can prove it, he can actually prove it to somebody, it's going to take a long time to challenge ideas that have been around for thousands of years. Next, we're going to take a look at the Great Plague of 1665, not to be confused with the Black Death of the 1340s, which was mentioned in our medieval medicine video. So the Great Plague is in 1665. Let's look at more details surrounding that. So the Great Plague of 1665 was mainly in Britain, but especially in London. It was in other parts of the country as well. For instance, there was a town called Eyam in England. I forget exactly where in England Eyam is now, but you can actually visit it. And it was essentially wiped out during the Great Plague. Side note, I was in a play at college all about the village of Eyam. Anyway, so most of what I'm going to talk to you about now is based on London. So a quarter of London's population were killed in this 1 year from the Great Plague. If you're interested in understanding this in a bit more detail, if you Google bills of mortality from 1665, a bill of mortality gives you a list of all of the things that people died from and how many people died from it. There are some very amusing things that people are dying from at this time. For instance, I remember on one of the bills of mortality that I used during a lesson, someone is killed being frightened, for instance. But my point is, back to the Great Plague, you will be able to see just how high the numbers were people were dying of plague from. At this time, despite the fact we have got all of this development going on with Paré, Vesalius and Harvey, people still believed that God had sent the Black Death as punishment for sins. This is where we start to get people's houses with the red crosses painted on the door, and sometimes they might have phrases like, oh my gosh, what does it say? Oh, have mercy on this house, God have mercy on this house, and things like that. It was also like a little bit of a quarantine measure, so people knew not to go in there. I'm now saying this and thinking I may well mention it in a couple of points' time, but never mind. So God sending the plague as punishment for sin was still very much believed. So prayer is a very popular method of treatment at this time. Four humours is still believed as well. Again, despite what William Harvey is able to prove, people are still bloodletting at this time. And there is a much greater focus this time round on miasma theory, the idea that bad air and bad smells were causing the illness. And this is much greater than it was during the Black Death. This is when we start to get these quack doctors coming around who wore these masks with those long beaks stuffed with sweet smelling herbs. The idea was, if the bad air was causing the illness, if the bad smell was causing the illness, then replace it with good smell instead. Pretty much like Galen's theory of opposites, you could argue. Quack doctors were also, and I think we're going to go on to mention these in a little bit, but I will chuck it in here now as well, just in case. Quack doctors were basically con men, con artists that travelled around the country saying, oh, if you buy this special remedy, you'll be cured of all illnesses and things like that. So much greater focus on miasma theory during the Great Plague. And essentially, that is because we're still getting towns and cities that are really, really stinky and smelly. And we are still getting this idea of overcrowding happening a lot more as well at this time. Here's an interesting one. Hello, where have we seen this? During the Great Plague, people were banned from meeting together in large crowds to try and stop the spread of the plague. Yeah, that's right. Coronavirus, you are not the first pandemic to try and stop that try and stop people from meeting to stop illness from spreading. And you know what's really fascinating is that they're clearly learning here in 1665 from what was successful in the Black Death. Quarantine measures were very successful in the Black Death in stopping the disease from spreading. But what I think is even more interesting in 1665 is that they still don't know about germs. So they know that meeting in large places or being in close contact with someone will give you the plague, but they don't understand why that is the case, which I think is just so fascinating. Like I said, quarantine laws were brought in to stop the plague from happening again. For instance, ships that were coming into Britain, if it was known that there was somebody who was ill or there was a disease spreading through, an illness spreading through the men on the ship, then nobody would be allowed off that boat when the ship came into Britain for a certain number of time. So those quarantine laws happening there. So some progress we can see potentially from the Black Death. Also at this time, we are in a position where public health laws can be spread throughout the country a lot easier. We are talking about a time here where we have a much stronger centralised government. So by 1665, Charles II is on the throne. For you horrible history fans out there, he is the king that brought back partying. And just before that, so in between Charles I and Charles II, we have that time where we have no monarch on the throne whatsoever. Our country is a republic, and instead Parliament are in charge, specifically a guy called Oliver Cromwell. So during that time, Parliament and government assumes a lot more power than they used to. And when King Charles II comes back, he very much is able to get Parliament on his side, and he convinces them that he is not interested in getting rid of them. He is very much interested in getting rid of the people who were responsible for the death of his father. However, if you weren't responsible for that and you're in government, you're absolutely fine. So we have much more of a stronger centralised government at this time. So laws, for instance, are a lot easier to spread across the country. For instance, this idea from banning people from meeting together in large crowds. Next, we're going to be having a look at an individual that when I studied medicine through time, back when I did my GCSEs, back in the 90s, here's someone I didn't learn about. Here is somebody who has come into the course with the new GCSE that was brought in a few years ago. He is a British physician, a British doctor called John Hunter. And it kind of feels like with John Hunter, you name it, he did it. You name it, he did it when it comes to his discoveries. So he has a wide range of medical experience. He starts out in the anatomy, and he gets lots of experience in dissection because his brother sets up an anatomy school, and he works with his brother with that in mind. He then moves on to become a surgeon in the army, and he raises through the ranks to become the top army surgeon in the country. John Hunter was a real pioneer when it came to medical research. And he was a bit of an oddball. He was a bit radical with his ideas. And I don't think anything really summarises it better than this fact right here. John Hunter wanted to be able to prove that it was possible to have two venereal diseases, two sexually transmitted diseases, at the same time. And to do that, he gives himself gonorrhea and syphilis to prove that he can have both, or that anyone can have both at the same time. So a bit of a radical, bit out there, gives himself two highly contagious diseases. I don't know how he gave it to himself, or whether he went about it in the traditional way that you get gonorrhea and syphilis. But yes, the students that I've taught in the past have affectionately referred to John Hunter, therefore, as gonorrhea guy. And that's what he is widely remembered for. He is also cured of gonorrhea and syphilis, and the way that people cured gonorrhea and syphilis at this time was through having mercury vapor treatment. And if you know anything about mercury, you'll know it's poisonous. And he would have gone through, I think he went through at least a year of mercury vapor treatment, where you basically lie down on a table and have a kind of mercury steam kind of poured, like kind of steamed over you, such especially over your nose and mouth and everything. Absolutely hideous, but there we go. That's the price you have to pay for being a pioneer in scientific experiment. John Hunter becomes part of the Company of Surgeons. That is still around today, but however it is called the Royal College of Surgeons. And the Company of Surgeons was set up by the British government, the English government, to showcase the skill of surgeons better than barber surgeons. Now, these ideas were already starting to kind of bubble up in the medieval times, that the kind of skilled surgeons like John Hunter, like Ambroise Paré, for instance, although he was French, they really wanted to distinguish themselves than the lower class barber surgeons that would just carry out bloodletting and amputations. So the government sets up the Company of Surgeons to do exactly that. And like I said, John Hunter becomes part of the Company of Surgeons. He is a very significant part of the Company of Surgeons as well. And I just would want to say that this is a really good example of the government getting involved in medicine, and a positive example of government in medicine. John Hunter publishes loads and loads of books. I'm talking hundreds of books. My personal favourite that he wrote is one on, not that I've read it, but the title alone is The History of Teeth, which I think is a great title there. He also writes about the blood, following on from the work of William Harvey. He does lots of work on surgery, and he is a big believer that surgeons need to study the anatomy to be at the top of their game. Of course, he writes about venereal diseases after his experiment with gonorrhea and syphilis. He writes about cancers. Yes, we've been aware of cancer for many, many centuries. He writes about infections as well, but his most influential book is one he writes about treating gunshot wounds. And he basically says in this book that you should treat a gunshot wound in exactly the same way as you would treat any other wound. You don't have to treat them in a special way, treat them as any other wound. So here's a really nice example of somebody developing on the work of Ambroise Paré and that herbal remedy he was able to recall from the Roman times to treat gunshot wounds specifically, whereas John Hunter is saying, don't treat a gunshot wound any differently to as you would treat any other wound. Despite the amazing things that John Hunter achieves in his life, John Hunter eventually dies in poverty, a kind of real riches to rags story. And my gosh, you would be kind of freaked out if you went to visit his house, because his house was just full of these jars of preserved animals, plants, fossils, diseased organs and body parts. He had 3,000 of these things just lying around in his house. So here is a great example here. I'm thinking and talking at the same time. When I mark people's work about factors and they talk about individuals, they're really good at explaining why individuals specifically, like for instance, they could explain why John Hunter is important or why Vesalius is important. But when you think about individuals in general, you've got to think about these are people who are willing to push the boundaries. These are people who are willing to take risks for the benefit of developing medicine. If we didn't have individuals like John Hunter, there are so many things that we wouldn't be aware of. So rather than when you get to a position where you're explaining an individual, the role of individuals in general, try not to explain an individual specific example. Try and talk about individuals in general, how we need people like Hunter, like Vesalius, like Paré, like Harvey, who are willing to push the boundaries and take advantage of new developments. Like, for instance, Vesalius taking advantage of developments in art, Paré taking advantage of and Harvey as well, taking developments in science and technology to help with their discoveries. They are willing to use the developments in these other factors to push the boundaries, to pioneer and make these achievements. Yes, I think John Hunter is, kind of pushing it in a different way, you could argue, especially with his little self-experiment that he does. But nonetheless, we wouldn't know about that if it wasn't for people willing to take risks. We're going to move on now to look at hospitals. And just as a recap from the medieval times, remember hospitals were very rare in the Christian parts of Europe. And where they did exist, they were not there to treat the sick, but to care for them. That was very different in the Islamic Empire. The Islamic Empire had hospitals in which treatment did actually take place in the medieval times. One of the reasons why we get the development of specific hospital buildings during the Renaissance is due to the religious changes in our country during the Reformation. Henry VIII closed down the monasteries during the Reformation when he was setting up his own Church of England. And he does that for two reasons. Firstly, because he wants the money from the monasteries. And also, secondly, monks are devout Catholics, so they did not really feature in his plan for setting up a Church of England. How that links to hospitals is because, and we would have gone through this in the medieval medicine video, is that monasteries had these areas called infirmaries in them, which was essentially the closest thing to a hospital that people had at that time. People would go there for rest and for care and for a good diet and so on. And with the monasteries shut down, with them, for many of them, demolished, new hospitals needed to be set up. And what happens is we get the rich and wealthy members of society funding the creation of new hospitals. And what we notice is that religious connection continues as a lot of these new hospitals are named after saints. You might be able to think of an example near you, possibly. The main ones that spring to my mind are the ones in London, We have St Mary's Hospital, for instance, and there is a very large significant hospital near London Bridge called Guy's and St Thomas's. So St Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, which were created during the Renaissance as well. This was a really kind of showy-offy thing that rich people like to do, funding hospitals, and also by naming them after saints, they thought it would be a good way that would help them get into heaven once they died. Yes, despite all of the developments of the Renaissance, people still were exhibiting those strong religious attitudes. The difference between a hospital in the Renaissance and a hospital in the medieval times is that although rest and care were given, treatments were used by doctors in Renaissance hospital, particularly herbal remedies at this time. That's the main thing we're looking at. So we're starting to see, obviously we would have had like things like bloodletting as well, but we're seeing this importance of herbal remedies coming into the treatment that happens in these hospitals. We also see a relaxation of the church control over the training of doctors. And many hospitals trained doctors specifically, and a lot of doctors were keen to do this because if they were given a permanent position in a hospital, then that would mean that they were a really, really good doctor. So for instance, if you were at St Thomas's Hospital and you were trained there, you could work hard enough to be one of the resident doctors of St Thomas's Hospital. And because the hospital had such a reputation, so would you as well. We also start to see the development of specific wards in hospitals at this time. We also have the development of specific hospitals as well. For instance, you started to get hospitals set up for people with leprosy, and also we start to see asylums spring up. And these are hospitals for those with mental illnesses. Now, we are really dealing with a time here where mental illness is not treated with the care and respect that it deserves. And this is where you start to get this idea of lunatics from as well, which is very much developed into industrial and Victorian society too. So these asylums are effectively prisons, and some of the primary sources that we have from the asylums are just absolutely horrifying in terms of what happened there. And, here, I'm recording this now in 2020, like looking back on our understandings of mental health now, and, we're not even all the way there. We are still learning about mental health all the time. But to see the way people with mental illness were treated is just absolutely horrifying. But nonetheless, the reason that we're looking at this here is to notice that hospitals are getting a lot more sophisticated here. And by that I mean you just don't have one hospital in general. We're starting to see people specialising and branching out into specific hospitals for specific illnesses. It's around this time as well that you start to get maternity hospitals as well, so hospitals for women who are going to be giving birth. We're going to finish up then by looking at doctors. Here is that image of one of those quack doctors from during the plague. You can see why they get the term the quack doctor. It's because of that beak that they've got going on there. You can also see, this guy would not be out of place in my local supermarket during coronavirus. He's got his gloves on, so he's not going to be contaminating anybody. He's completely covered from head to toe. There's nothing showing there. And he's got his stick to make sure that people keep his distance. This guy would be right at home in the 2020 coronavirus self-isolation, quarantine, social distancing world. As I mentioned in that previous slide when we were looking at hospitals, the training of doctors is less controlled now by the church. Don't get me wrong, it is still happening. For instance, you will still get doctors who train through church-based universities. However, we are seeing doctors trained more so in specific hospitals. Now, if you lived in England, in Britain at the time during the Renaissance, you would still need to pay if you wanted to see a qualified doctor. So for a lot of poor people, which still made up the majority of our population at this time, most of these people are not paying to see a qualified doctor. That is something that was exclusively for the rich people, those who could afford it. Instead, the poor people, they are still using the same kind of methods from the medieval times. For instance, going to see the wise person in your village. Also, for instance, as we're going to talk about them in a second, seeing a quack doctor as well. Most people would still go to a barber surgeon as well. They are still existing at this time. Again, the wise woman. Remember though, when we were looking at John Hunter, during the Renaissance in Britain, we start to get this distinction between more highly qualified surgeons as opposed to an apprenticed barber surgeon. Bloodletting, despite the work of William Harvey, is still the main treatment, the main go-to at this time. We talked a little bit about them beforehand. Those quack doctors were essentially traveling salesmen who would go around the country and would con people out of their money by providing these so-called miracle cures, like kind of bottles with nondescript liquids inside them. And, you know, if you drink this, then you'll live forever, and so on and so forth. It's why, you might well have come across this before, you might not have, one of the kind of nicknames, colloquialisms for a doctor is a quack. That's where the connection comes from there. But yeah, quack doctors were essentially con men. But if you are poor, and you couldn't afford access to a qualified doctor, and then this guy turns up out of the blue, he's really mysterious, you've never seen him before, and they intentionally moved around so they couldn't be kind of tracked down or anything like that, you would be really taken in. They'd be massive showmen as well, you know, step right up and come and see, so on and so forth. And people would be totally sucked in by what they were presenting. And they would like plant people in the crowd to say, yes, you, sir, you have used this medicine and this happened to you, to kind of to prove that their medicines worked. Absolute con men, but people were very easily taken in by them. Thanks to an increased trade and travel and the discovery of new lands during the Renaissance. Gosh, that's something we haven't talked about at all. This is the time when we're starting to get the discovery of the Americas, for instance. This is when we're getting much more widespread travel towards India as well. We are getting much more exotic herbs that are being brought back to Britain to be more commonly used in treatments. So the increased trade and travel would go under the factor of communications when we're thinking in terms of looking at factors that contribute. So widespread trade and travel during the Renaissance to the Americas, for instance, and also to more areas of Asia as well, mean we're getting more and more herbal remedies that can be used. Because not only when you go to these lands to travel and trade, not only are you able to pick up these exotic herbs, you are able to learn from the people there in terms of how they are used. And then this is the kind of thing that like some quack doctors would get hold of and try and exploit, because especially if they presented an exotic herb that people had never heard of before, say, oh, look at this saffron, you know, which would actually, that would be an incredibly expensive one for them to use, but let's kind of go with it. Look at this saffron, it can be used to cure the common cold, maybe, or something like that. We have still got loads and loads of superstition around at this time. Still this belief in the evil planets aligning to cause illness, especially when the Great Plague came along. Despite all the scientific advancements and new inventions that were helping us understand our world and our solar system better, we still have a lot of this superstition that was going on. And that is the last thing we're going to say about that. That's the end of our Renaissance medicine video. I really hope that you found this One History Help video useful. Let your friends know about it if they're struggling with their revision for their medicine course. And like I said, there are 2 more videos to come, one on industrial medicine and one on modern medicine as well. Don't forget, there is already the medieval medicine one and also the video where I go through all of the significant individuals from the medicine course as well. You can, of course, subscribe to this channel so you get updates when the new videos are put up. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at One History Help, and you'll also find me on Facebook. Just search for One History Help. Take care of yourselves, everybody, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye-bye.